road sector or any other building, any other construction project which is being implemented in PPP mode, which has a longish concession period, say 5 years or more, we also have to factor in the operation and maintenance costs which are required to be incurred by the concessionaire. Because besides construction, the concessionaire is also an O&M operator, operations and maintenance operator. He has to operate and maintain the facility. It could be a complete overlay of the road every 7 years down the line. It could be regular maintenance of a building, whatever form, depending on the dynamics of the project. Now, from the point of view of a private concessionaire, the length of the concession period should be long enough to allow the concessionaire to recoup its investment and obtain a reasonable return within that period, when the scope and severity of risks involved in the particular project and opportunity costs in the current and future markets are taken into consideration. For the public client, the concessionaire's return should not be excessive compared to its commitments and efforts, and benchmarked with information on costs and rate of return that are available in the current and future markets. Typically, when the projects are awarded, we come across people talking about a rate of return, IRR, internal rate of return, varying between 15 to 20% or even as high as 21% in some of the cases. Whatever is the rate of return at which the project is awarded, on the presumption that it's being done in an absolutely transparent manner on a competitive basis, there should be no objection in awarding it at, say, 20% IRR or 21%. If there are 5 bidders, very close bids, no harm in awarding if someone is expecting a 21% rate of return, because it is he who is investing the capital and it is he who is taking the risk with regard to the project for the next 30 years or so. That is, in fact, the global thought process, what people who are implementing PPPs across the world think, whether we go down to Middle East or we go to Europe and even in India. But one thing which has been bothering the Indian PPP implementation teams is the lack of clarity that what are the dynamics of a PPP. We have seen Comptroller and Auditor General CAG teams coming up with audit paras saying that if a particular project has been awarded at, I'll give you an example of a particular bus terminal which was awarded at a reasonable rate of return of 16%. After competitive bids were received, 4 bids were received, the lowest was at 16% IRR got the project. Now after 3 years there is a CAG para as per which had the bus terminal been developed by the government, then government would have earned all those profits which are now accruing to the private sector entrepreneur. The question is why the government was not able to do it. The government did not have the funds. Government wanted to do it through a bus stand management company, but the company was refused the loans. So the question is, the choice is whether to do it or not to do it. Now if the choice is between doing it and not doing it, whether we allow the private sector to come in and make a reasonable profit, because private sector is certainly not going to come and join hands and invest money for charity. They want some rate of return. We have to spell that out, whether it's 12%, 16%, 21%. Now, if the government auditors who are auditing the concerned government departments, if this is the way they think, that whatever profit has accrued to private sector entrepreneurs, that is the loss which has been caused to the government, PPPs are not going to work in India. We had a brainstorming session with the CAG, a lot of debate took place, and we came to the conclusion that if PPPs are to be audited, there have to be auditors who are specially trained for auditing the PPPs. Because there are so many risks which an operator is taking, these cannot be factored into an Excel sheet. There are regulatory risks which are besides the financial risks. You cannot allocate numbers to them. There are political risks. If a government changes, sometimes they say you give free passes to the journalists or you give free passes to all MLAs if they are not entitled otherwise. So how does the private entrepreneur factor in for all these issues? So we all have been through a learning curve, and I feel that in India this learning curve is going to continue for the next 10 or 15 years. because India is yet to become a developed nation. We are on our journey from being a developing nation to a developed nation. And the PPP learning graph will also piggyback this growth story of India. But there are various issues like this. Like Mr. Gandhi used the terminology of glorified real estate. I call it sale of government properties under the garb of PPP. If you have a 6-acre piece of land, you want to implement a bus terminal, you have two choices. Either government invests the money, constructs the bus terminal, that's it. And if you want to do it on a PPP mode, you do a simple BOT project, structure it in a manner that the entrepreneur is providing some commercial facilities which are relevant for the passengers, passenger-related amenities, and you confine those commercial facilities. The next stage was about 4-5 years ago. Governments across India, I would not like to name the state governments, they started doing shopping malls come bus terminals. And today we are at a stage where the main project is the shopping mall and bus terminal is a byproduct. You have huge fully air-conditioned shopping malls, bus terminal is a byproduct, the buses have entry from the backside. And the concession periods, which earlier used to be 8.5 years, 9 years, 12 years for the bus terminals, and operators were very happy getting a return of 16 to 20% with 10 years of concession period. Now the concession periods have been increased to as long as 90 years. Now I would call it sale of government properties under the garb of PPP. The dynamics, the financial dynamics of these projects are that once the facility is ready, if the concession period is small, say up to 30 years or 40 years, the operator would sublease certain facilities for smallish periods of 5 years, 10 years or 15 years and settle for a monthly rent with the sublessees and the sublicensees. But when as a government you hand over the facility for 90 years, he capitalizes that lease. Then he doesn't talk to sublessees in terms of monthly rate of rent. Instead of 50 rupees a square feet, he says 10,000 rupees a square feet. The market response he gets from the takers is that this is not a freehold property. Then he says that okay, it's a 90-year leasehold, you give me 6,000 rupees upfront. So at the end of the day, we have to realize which are the priority areas for doing PPPs and what is the right way of doing PPPs. And there's a time constraint, I believe, so I think we could.
You can just wind up in a minute.
Yeah, so I want to end up my talk and sum it up by saying that we need to be doing PPPs after a lot of thinking, not in a hurried manner, and not be driven by vested interests or not being driven by what the private sector wants, but keeping the public interest on the forefront. And the concept of public sector comparator is totally missing in India. That is the only good thing we have in Europe, that they spend 6 to 12 months applying a public sector comparator to evaluate that whether it will be beneficial for the public if the project is implemented in the public mode by public funding or by private funding. The public sector comparator models are yet to develop in India, and quite often we find political bosses also averse to public sector comparator because it entails delays. You need 4 to 6 months time at least to apply a public sector comparator, do a study whether it will be beneficial to implement a project in PPP mode or with complete public funding.
I'll just flag a few issues and then the gentleman who will ask the question will get his answer. I'm just flagging a few critical issues. We are looking at modeling public-private sector are very intricate financial models. On one side, you have the private finance initiatives of UK, where you have the availability model, where the entire risk is taken by the public. And then you have other models at the other end of the spectrum, where the entire risk is transferred to the private entity. And we've got to find some interesting answers in between these two spectrums. The other issue relates to how do you develop a high-class concessionaire agreement which is transparent, and there are as few opaque or vague costs as possible, as an economic cycle permits. And there the key issues are that when you prepare a concessionaire agreement, what is the construction period, what is the operation period? What are the construction costs, what are the operation and maintenance costs? And whether it brings about a reasonable return for the private sector initiative after meeting the costs. So the concessionaire agreement should look at these three key variables of any concessionaire agreement in order to draft it or construct it properly. Then there are issues, there are 5 key issues: technical, financial, legal, commercial and economic. Technical is to what extent you have expertise in modeling so that you can project the cost on a road project or on a metro project. What is the peak hour, peak direction load which you project, and what is, when it's not peak hour, what is the load it comes to, and thereby you look at how it is going to grow. All the first 4 factors will depend on the economic cycle through which the country is moving. So they are technical parameters, they are financial modeling parameters as to how you protect the public interest and how you give a good return for private initiative. There are legal aspects that you can't give free passes in the middle of something. You can't insist once you have decided what the toll should be, that the toll should be reduced because there's some morchas going on. Otherwise, the government will have to compensate for the reduction. The government can give a grant and say, look, people are up in arms, the toll is very high, we'll give you a grant for whatever is the gap. Then there are commercial aspects. Whether they're SEZs, which are almost very high majority, are in the metropolitan zone, where I don't know what industry they'll generate, but they'll generate huge real estate income. So you're wanting to do, as Gagan rightly said, a bus stop. You can't, as part of the bus stop, build up a huge mall. You can provide some conveniences, some canteens, some other facilities. But so, how should you balance greed in terms of huge commercial, sort of stuff that you can get with what is needed, what is required, what the nature of that facility requires, and that commercial gain should be given and actually loaded as a revenue in terms of the cost income. And finally, your projections about the economic cycle. Economic cycles are very difficult to predict, but over large periods of times, looking at different trends, some amount of projections can be made. In order to look at that, when you look at regulation or look at how to safeguard public interest, at least in the telecom sector or in several other sectors, there are 3 possibilities which I would like you to consider and ask the panelists questions. One is the government setting up a body which is kind of promoter. I'm referring to infrastructure, leasing and financial services, which was set up when I was in the Ministry of Urban Development, where the ILFS, which had initially a majority stake from the government and slowly that stake was reduced, to set up SPVs. So the Noida toll bridge project was an SPV coming out of the ILFS. So it's the promoter, or promoter comes semi-regulator, like the Punjab Infrastructure Development Board. Then you have that if you develop this, I think the promoter should not be regulator. Our experience in the telecom sector. So you can have a promoter from government who's looking at long-term projects, who's doing precisely what Anil was saying, that you might have regulators who are toothless and clueless because they don't know the subject. But if you have somebody promoting it and studying these agreements over a long period, then by sheer accretion of knowledge, you improve. So you could have a promoter, you could have a regulator, and then we wonder whether the regulator should have an appellate authority before it goes to the High Court or the highest court. So you can look at 3 different models: promoter, regulator, and appellate, for safeguarding public interest. And finally, what is the role of the public sector comparator? Should the promoter, which is, we are talking of a government body, well, government appointed body, you could have lots of private fellows on it, which does comparator